Lowy Institute board members, including Stephen Lowy, our Deputy Chair, Penny Wensley, from our board, Mark Ryan, and particularly appropriately today, Sir Angus Houston, former Chief of the Defence Force, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this address by the Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Simon Stuart. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Institute. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands, and I pay my respects to their elders. And I'd also like to wish everybody happy Liberation Day. Isn't it exciting? Isn't it exciting? Ladies and gentlemen, 10 years ago, I was honoured to be invited to give the Boyer Lectures on the ABC. And I remember I began my first lecture by recalling the memoir of Dean Acheson, who was Harry Truman's Secretary of State. And Acheson's generation of American statesmen really created the post-war world. They rescued Europe from financial ruin. They established the institutions of global order. They set the conditions for a long season of prosperity and relative peace. And Acheson called his memoirs Present at the Creation. And in my lecture 10 years ago, I argued that we would soon be present at the destruction of a world order that has served Australia's interests well. Now, not everything that you write holds up well 10 years later. But I have to say, I think, unfortunately, I got that one right. Because today, Acheson's creation, the world order that he and his generation stood up, is beset on all sides. Every day, the liberal international order looks less liberal, less international, and less orderly. The United States seems to be so resentful of free riders on the bus that it's forgotten the advantages of actually driving the bus. It's narrowing the definition of the American national interest, and it's changing its policies on all sorts of important issues like who's an ally, who's an adversary, and whether trade serves America's interests or not, as we're seeing today. At the same time, challenges, including in Moscow and Beijing, are up on their hind legs. All of this presents an acute security challenge for a country such as Australia that has only 27 million people occupying a continent of its own, a long way away from our historic sources of security and prosperity. In this context, some have suggested that the election on the 3rd of May could be a khaki election. But ironically, most of the debate about defence in recent years has been about white uniforms, not about khaki uniforms. It's focused on the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Fleet, and on AUKUS, the plan to acquire Virginia-class submarines and then AUKUS-class submarines. But of course, for most of Australia's history, the service that has left its imprint most clearly on the Australian character, and indeed on the world, has been the Australian Army. If we look at the distant theatres to which Australians have been deployed over the century, South Africa, the Dardanelles, Europe and Egypt in the First World War, Papua New Guinea in the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, in most cases, these were army deployments. And Russia's 22 invasion of Ukraine, kicking off the first major land war in Europe since the Second World War, is a stark reminder of the enduring importance of land power. So it's in this context that we are really delighted to host today at Bligh Street Lieutenant General Simon Stuart, Australia's Chief of Army, who is responsible, if government asks him and puts a request to him, who is responsible for deploying Australia's land power. General Stuart enlisted as a private soldier in the Army in 1987. He was commissioned into the Royal Australian Infantry Corps in 1990. Throughout his career, he's commanded on operations in East Timor, Afghanistan, Egypt, Israel, and served in many roles here in Australia, including as head of land capability. He was awarded a Distinguished Service Cross in 2014 and was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2020. He assumed command of the Australian Army in July 2022. He's known for being one of the most thoughtful officers, general officers in the Australian Defence Force, and so we're delighted to welcome General Stuart to Bligh Street today to give an important lecture. General, the lectern is yours.
Well, Michael, to you, to the board and to the Institute, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. I'm very, very grateful. In my view, the Lowy Institute is an exemplar in long-form, respectful contest of ideas, and I think that's a great credit to the Institute, and I'm very honoured to be here today. Now, 2 years ago this month, the epoch-defining, independently conducted Defence Strategic Review was published, and of course we're honoured to have one of its architects here in Sir Angus Houston. Epoch-defining in the same way as the 1987 White Paper that shaped defence policy, strategy and the employment of the ADF for the preceding 3.5 decades. The DSR, as it's known, and reflected in the National Defence Strategy of 2024, conclude that we face the most challenging strategic circumstances since the end of the Second World War. And Australia must, for the first time in more than 80 years, consider seriously how to manage the risk of major conflict in our region. Of course, our contemporary circumstances are entirely historically consistent. And to quote Charles Edel and Hal Brands from their book, The Lessons of Tragedy, for centuries, leading thinkers and statesmen have periodically concluded that humanity is finally leaving behind the dark shadows of geopolitical strife and entering the sunlit uplands of international harmony. Well, the geopolitics of today bear more resemblance to those described by Thucydides some 2.5 millennia ago than they do the proclamations of Francis Fukuyama and the like just 3 decades ago. The last few years are evidence enough. The growing authoritarian partnership between Russia, China, Iran and North Korea is now manifest. Witness North Korean troops fighting in Eastern Europe and a renewed proxy war in the Middle East. Global and regional norms, including those governing arms control, are stressed. The world is an increasingly uncertain, anxious and dangerous place. And as the late, great Alan Gyngell observed in 2018, I can't think of a more challenging time to be a policymaker in Australia. Now, I wonder what he would make of things nearly a decade on. So what does this mean for me as the accountable steward of the Australian Army today? I'm by nature an optimist, and with good reason, because the Army that I'm privileged to lead today is by nearly every measure better than the one that I joined in 1987. The young Australians volunteering to serve in our Army today, your Army today, are the very best generation to wear our nation's uniform, and they inspire my confidence. But it's my professional obligation to be at once a realist, a constructive pessimist, and to cultivate what Aristotle poetically described as a tragic sensibility. In short, I must prepare the Army for the worst and pray for the best. The government's direction to me is clear and transformative. Quite simply, optimise the Army for littoral manoeuvre and long-range strike as part of an integrated and focused ADF in support of a national strategy of deterrence, and do it quickly. The Army has moved very quickly to set conditions for this transformation over the last 23 months. And I'm confident we will achieve our 2025 milestones. We've already adapted our concepts, our command and control, our capabilities, and indeed our culture. And I could not be more proud of what our soldiers have achieved. However, a transformation of such consequence demands a comprehensive approach to every dimension of our Army, which is at once a national institution, a profession, and a fighting force. So today, I will again focus on the Army profession, the moral and intellectual foundations that define us as an Army, importantly in relation to the society from which we are drawn and for whom we exist to serve. Indeed, as Napoleon posited, in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. My remarks today form the third in a series of 4 addresses on the state of the Army profession that began in September last year. In the first address, I baselined the profession through the lenses of history, context and culture. In the second, I proposed a diagnosis of the contemporary challenges to the Army profession, and today I intend to describe how we are executing the task of assessing the state of our profession over the coming year. To assist us, we've adopted a framework of 3 pillars that provide a common benchmark for all professions. The first pillar is our jurisdiction, that is, how we define the unique service that we provide to the society we serve. The second pillar is our expertise, the distinct professional body of knowledge for which we are accountable. And thirdly, our capacity for self-regulation as a profession. Our ability to not only maintain good order, discipline, but also accountability in the face of the corrupting nature of warfare. These 3 pillars will also provide the structure to my remarks today, just as they will throughout our review over the coming year. So if I may begin with jurisdiction. When I spoke at the ANU's National Security College in November last year, I highlighted this as the primary pillar, that which defines us and our purpose. I posited that the unique purpose of the Australian Army was perhaps unclear to the nation that we serve, and that the place of the Australian Army profession in society, including central concepts like the contract of unlimited liability, is indistinct, and as a result, I argued, we need to address it. The obvious question, of course, is how. In 1989, the theorist Carl H. Bilder wrote the following in his book, The Masks of War. An army requires a theory of an army. There must exist something in addition to its soldiers and tanks and guns, a concept, a strategy, a notion of who it is and what it wants to be, what it is about and what it wants to be about. Wise words. They capture a central question for both the Australian Army and the society we serve. What sort of army does Australia need in the middle decades of the 21st century? Some examples might be helpful here. The Royal Navy in the Second World War developed the theory of the 2-power standard, a navy that had to be stronger than the next 2 largest navies in the world in order to be effective. Or the US Army in the post-Vietnam era developed a theory of an army that could, in the words of the great reformer General Don Sturry, win while outnumbered, through expertise in manoeuvre warfare, operational art, and the application of exquisite technology. The history of the theory of the Australian Army is fairly simple. We've traditionally been an expeditionary army committed to securing Australia's principal alliance interests by fighting overseas. A simple but compelling theory, because putting soldiers on the ground and in harm's way has always been and remains the most profound expression of national will and commitment. Recall Prime Minister Billy Hughes, nicknamed the Little Digger, who justified his and Australia's presence at Versailles at the conference in 1919 with the words, "I speak for 60,000 dead." Our most recent commitments to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan mark continuity in this sine wave of Australia's history. Visible, tangible commitments to shared interests and values with our principal ally and our partners. But how do we see the future of our theory? Some fundamentals are likely to endure. It seems clear that we will continue to place a premium on partnerships, remaining militarily engaged overseas. As Rory Metcalf remarks in his book, Conquest for the Indo-Pacific, in this multipolar age, nations will not succeed in securing their interests if they pursue strategies in isolation. The region is too vast and complex for any country to protect its interests alone. But it's also clear that we require a new theory, one that is equal to the demands of our new era. The future is deeply uncertain, and we have little historical context for an Indo-Pacific beset by a multipolar great power competition. And to paraphrase H.R. McMaster, we have a perfect record in predicting future wars. And that record is 0%. We need to think anew if we are indeed to act anew. Now, our Army has taken the first steps toward defining this transformational theory. Last year, we published a revised capstone document titled The Australian Army Contribution to the National Defence Strategy of 2024. And there's some copies up the back. It looks like this. This tells the story of a rapidly adapting army, one confident in its history, but clear in its need to continually adapt. It depicts an army focused, rediscovering its ability to fight and prevail in the littorals, that is, the shallows, the beaches, the rivers, jungles, and the coastal towns that characterise our region. It's a good start, but the emergent theory is not yet sufficiently clear. Definition is our focus this year. Much of this work is our responsibility. Our society, however, also has an indispensable part to play. As I noted in November, an army cannot define its own jurisdiction. And in an era of great power competition, where defence and security is once again a national endeavour, this task is a collaboration between the soldier, the citizen, and the state. This is the essence of what is known as civil-military relations. The questions here are pressing. Throughout our history as a nation, we've relied on the protection afforded by our geography and the assumption of warning time for conflict. In times of war, we've leveraged these protections and assumptions to build the army, indeed our defence force, and national resilience. And we've needed the national resilience that we've needed to defend Australia and our interests. But as the National Defence Strategy makes clear, those assumptions of distance and time are no longer valid. A war in our region would be an immediate and significant risk to our national security and prosperity. It could come with limited warning and would certainly have far-reaching consequences. We can learn much from our own history and indeed the history of warfare. The siren song of interwar thinking is enticing. Interwar thinking being the idea that the next war will somehow be quick, will be decisive, will be fought at ever-increasing distance and everywhere, but on the land and among people. But such thinking is profoundly ahistoric. And this is a tragedy as much as it is a truth. We are, like many, studying what's happening in Ukraine closely. And from my foxhole, the lessons of national resilience are those from which we can learn the most. We need to remember that the army a nation begins a war with may not be the army it ends the war with. A Ukrainian general recently observed that while he started the war with a full-time professional force, the brigades he commanded were now composed largely by mobilised soldiers. Faced with new dilemmas, how do we, the army and the society we serve, work more closely together to resolve the thorny questions of the theory of our army? on national resilience and how we might sustain an army at war. It's for this reason that I've chosen the topic of the Army in Society for the annual Chief of Army Symposium this year, to be held at Parliament House in August. Where better to host a discourse on the future jurisdiction of our Army than in the People's House. Our jurisdiction is intrinsically connected to our expertise, the second of the three pillars of our profession. The maintenance of our distinctive body of professional knowledge and the ability to teach it and evolve it and adapt it is central to the ability to fight and win. The foundations of this body of knowledge are not fully fit for purpose in our changed circumstances, in my opinion. My guidance to our Army is therefore to strengthen our expertise in three very practical ways: through balance, through focus, and through adaptability. Firstly, on balance. The enduring obligation for all military professionals is to make judgments about the balance between war's enduringly human nature and its ever-changing character. War's changing character dominates our daily consciousness. The impact of technology is of an unprecedented scale and tempo. The advent of artificial intelligence in warfare may usher in a new age. For the first time, non-human entities may make decisions about the application of political violence. The Army clearly needs deep experts in leading-edge technologies, and we are blessed to have soldiers with doctorates in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, and experts in diverse fields such as hypersonics and space. It's quite clear that the ability to wield technology in war is a new basic requirement in soldiering. Shyam Sankar, the Chief Technology Officer of the US company Palantir, recently observed that warfighters need to know how to code, not because they will build industrial strength platforms, but because software is the most important and malleable weapon system. Knowing how to bend the software to your will is how you will bend the enemy to your will. There may be a slight element of hyperbole there, but I think his fundamental point is correct. The moulding of code will be as important for our soldiers as the employment of their weapons. These are, I believe, some of the future chapters in the canon of our professional body of knowledge. But balance means acknowledging the timeless continuities of war's nature as well as embracing the new technology. Technology does not replace the very human aspects of war. It is instead additive to how we go about leveraging them. The two must be considered together. It is very much an and, not an or proposition. So the Army certainly needs technologists and futurists, but we also need historians, philosophers, ethicists and strategists in equal measure. The challenge I've set for our team is to find the right balance between the two. The second factor is focus. Now this seems somewhat incongruous when you place it against balance, but that such are the contradictions of war. The National Defence Strategy directed the ADF to shift to being an integrated and focused force. The direction to focus is very clear, and the Army is transforming in turn. Our focus, perhaps uncontroversially, will be the battlefield, where soldiers engage in land combat in the most demanding of human endeavours, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. More so, we'll focus on the battlefield of the littoral. The history of Kokoda, Milne Bay, Buna and Sanananda tell us just how harrowing this battlefield can be. This is what we must prepare for. But what does it look like in practical terms in the 21st century? At the coalface of our Army, our training will be more challenging, certainly wetter, and more focused on conditioning for the battlefield. It will be wickedly complex. It will demand resilient soldiers and cohesive teams. But it will be good soldiering, the sort of service that most of our young Australians are joining for today. Adaptability is the third factor. An army must be able to adapt at pace and at a pace that is relevant to the war to which it is committed. The French army in both 1911 and 1939 was a professional force with a strong body of knowledge and all of the institutions to teach it. But they were unable to adapt when war's character was revealed. They sought to fight the war as they wished it would be, rather than as it was. Conversely, the armed forces of Ukraine hardwired adaptability into their force following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. I think that allowed them to withstand the initial Russian attacks in 2022 and to prevail today. Professor Sir Michael Howard wrote, "No matter how clearly one thinks, it is impossible to anticipate precisely the character of future conflict. The key is to not be so far off the mark that it becomes impossible to adapt once that character is revealed." So if we are to review the Army's capacity to adapt to ensure that we are fit for purpose, we must review in the knowledge and the expectation that we must be able to fight Australia's wars as they are, not as we may imagine or wish them to be. The key metric of success in war is the adversary. It has always been thus, and there are no prizes for second place. We must be able to adapt faster, to be more relevant and more credible than those that would seek to do us harm. The third pillar is our ability to self-regulate as a profession. I define this as our ability to uphold professional standards in our conduct, both in peace and in war. This is perhaps the hardest of the three pillars to address. It is also the one where I'm most determined to make a difference. My view remains that the concept of command and the accountability that comes with it must be the wellspring of our professional self-regulation. I assessed last year that the command relationship between our Army and the individual has not thrived these past 2 decades. Our failures have been as evident as our successes. This must be resolved, and it must be resolved before we once again face the corrupting influence of war. The time is now, and the question again is how. The start point, I believe, is to ensure we are doing everything we can to support our commanders in meeting our accountabilities to those that we are privileged to lead. This is the Army's institutional duty. We must carefully match the accountabilities of our commanders with the authorities and the resources that they are assigned, and that equation must be in balance. We ought to be confident in our commanders. We select them from our very best, and this warrants trust from the outset. Command decisions are often true dilemmas, particularly among the frictions of war. But our commanders should be confident to execute their duties, clear on their responsibilities, and filled with a sense of trust and support, both up and down the chain of command. Moreover, they must feel safe to fail fast in training and to learn, a key part of adaptation in war. But where things go wrong, where failure is intolerable, accountability is binary. This is as much about trust and confidence in the idea of command itself as it is about the individual or individual failings. There are already formal disciplinary and administrative ways to do this, but strong command accountability is as much about honour and culture as it is about applying laws and legislation. The way in which we execute command is the most prominent expression of the professional virtue ethic that ties our army together. It's ever been thus, given the inescapable and enduring human nature of war. Commanders in an army with a strong virtue ethic willingly recognise and embrace their accountabilities. They hold themselves to account first in how they think, speak and act every day. So along with our senior leadership team, we are reviewing and strengthening our virtue ethic, the core philosophy we hold toward our unique role as the assigned custodians of political violence. Starting at the top, if we can get this right, better command and better command accountability at all levels will naturally follow. So to conclude, jurisdiction, expertise and the ability to self-regulate. The frame for our review is set and the work has certainly begun, led as it should be by Army senior leaders. Where will it conclude? Well, that's a good question. The 14th of August this year will mark the 80th anniversary of the Allied victory in the Second World War, the end of 3 years of brutal fighting across the Pacific. The Australian Army that fought to achieve that victory had not even been imagined 4 years earlier. In 1941, the troops of the 6th, the 7th and the 9th Divisions were fighting in the deserts of North Africa, about as far away from Kokoda as one might imagine. They'd never set foot in a landing craft, never been trained in the jungle, and never hauled themselves off a beach under fire. The transformation of our army to fight in the Pacific War was quite simply remarkable. Perhaps one of the finest hours of our profession and indeed perhaps our nation. Perhaps most impressively was that this was all done in contact. Their example is both inspiring and instructive. The scale of the transformation of the Australian Army today is imbued with the same spirit, if not the same scale and circumstance. And the key difference is that we have the luxury of doing it out of contact. We have the opportunity to be more considered in our approach, to consider our profession in width, depth and context, and to learn from the experience of those who went before us. But time is not on our side, and as the National Defence Strategy concludes, Australia no longer enjoys the benefit of a 10-year window of strategic warning time for conflict. We must be and are indeed energetic and determined. We must use every moment available to us to ensure we can adapt should the character of war be revealed. Next year, the Australian Army will mark its 125th birthday. By then, I intend we will have the answers to the questions that I've posed today. And I look forward to sharing these answers with you and with our fellow citizens so that you may be fully engaged in writing the next chapter in the story of your army. Thank you.
Well, General, thank you very much. Thank you for those very considered remarks on your profession and on our army, all delivered with that sense of, as you mentioned, a tragic sensibility hanging over it. You mentioned the concepts of in contact and out of contact. I guess the speech was the out of contact element of today's event, and now we're going to have the in contact element. So thank you for agreeing to take some questions. And I'll kick off with a number of questions and then I will go to the audience and give them an opportunity to ask you some questions too. Let me start with Ukraine. You mentioned obviously that you've been keenly watching developments on the battlefield in Ukraine from your foxhole, as you put it. What are the biggest, you mentioned some lessons out of national resilience and also of moving from a volunteer army to a fully mobilised population. What are the other big lessons from Ukraine? And I'm thinking particularly the role of technology, UAVs, intelligence, all these kinds of things. What are the biggest lessons armies taken out of that land war?
Hey, thanks, Michael. That's a very contemporary question. Look, I'd preface it by saying that we need, I think, to approach the lessons we draw with a good deal of humility at the outset. I think in equal measure, as I was just discussing, to understand whether our theory about the balance between war's enduring human nature and its ever-changing character, which is dominated by technology, holds. We need to understand that each war is different, and that I certainly think one of the key characteristics of this war is time. There's a temporal aspect, both in terms of the fact that it didn't actually start in 2022, it started in 2014. We need to look at the full trajectory there, but also at the tactical level, the time, and I'm quoting Mick Ryan here, between detection and destruction has been significantly reduced, and that has a lot of if I can start or break up so what are we observing and what are the potential lessons? Firstly, when it comes to strategy, the assumptions that you make in a strategy are really important. And it's very, very clear that Mr. Putin got his strategic assumptions wrong. He had assumptions about who the Ukrainians were and whether or not they were indeed a nation, a polity. He made an assumption that they wouldn't fight, and he certainly made the assumption that the West and others would not support. He got 0 from 3 right there. Strategy is not a static endeavour. It interacts with its object, and it needs to adapt as a war unfolds. And I think that's important to know as well. 3 key other things that impact strategy. 1 is national will. 2 is the ability of leadership, national leadership, military leadership, to apply that will. And 3 is the economic and the industrial capacity. And obviously we see a large difference between Russia and Ukraine. And there's that old saying that mass has a quality, or quantity has a quality all of its own. So there's some physics involved there. So I think there's some of the sort of strategic observations, lessons that we can learn. Operationally and tactically, as I mentioned in my remarks, new technologies are additive. They don't replace what was there previously. They are additive. It is and, not or. What changes is the combination and the way that they're employed in what we call tactics, techniques, and procedures. One of the key questions that has been in my mind is the application of new technologies, and everyone's talking about drones, but uncrewed systems, whether they're in the air, on the ground, or on or below the surface of the water. Are they evolutionary or are they revolutionary? I don't see the evidence yet that they are revolutionary, because they've not provided a market advantage to one side or the other. So I think at this stage they're evolutionary. As we see the application, the continued application of more sophisticated machine learning and artificial intelligence, I think we need to keep a really close eye on whether that hypothesis continues to hold. So that's one thing we look at very, very closely, because understanding the history of warfare, there's always a cycle, a repeated cycle of action, reaction, and counteraction. So, whether it was the evolution of the machine gun, which was, the reaction of which was armour, and the tank. The tank and the anti-armour weapon, there's this continual sense of action, reaction, and counteraction. So counter UAS is the reaction and the counteraction at the moment. We see the growth in technology there. We're relearning a whole range of lessons that have been around for some time about the value of deception, about the requirement for dispersal, and about the requirement to be able to deal with large-scale casualties, which is something we're certainly not used to. And I'd also say that electronic warfare and integrated air and missile defence, or just air defence generally, and the combination of the two have seemed to be the key enablers for offensive manoeuvre, as well, of course, in the defence. Those are not new things, but the way in which they're combined and the fact that they become the rate-limiting factors, given the threat of UAS, I think really help us to understand perhaps where some of our gaps are.
All right, let me take you to that, because if we were to take a lesson from the Ukraine war, but also some of the wars in the Middle East, you're seeing the proliferation of missile technology. Even the Houthis are firing long-range missiles now. How do you think about defending military bases and indeed army formations against missile attack?
So there's no silver bullet to this, and as you said in your introduction, we're a very large, we have a lot of geography and a small population. So that explains why the essence of our national defence strategy is one of deterrence. But deterrence is based in large part on being relevant and credible in your ability to respond. So I'm often asked about, well, what is the role of the Army? What is the role of land power in the Indo-Pacific? Because the map is
blue.
It's blue. There's a fantastic map which is called the Land Bridge. It's in Rory's book, and I think it originates sort of last century. But it turns slightly the axis and shows the land bridge between Australia and the Eurasian continent, and it gives you a different perspective on things. That's not to dismiss the fact that there is a lot of blue out there, and we have a maritime strategy, quite rightly, but there's a difference between a naval strategy and a maritime strategy. Our strategy is all about an integrated force. The whole idea of an integrated force is that you are able to leverage the strengths of each domain and protect the weaknesses. In other words, we are more than the sum of our parts. But if you look at our region, then there are some things that haven't changed. The geography, in terms of that land bridge. We're a region of armies, some of the largest armies in the world, and armies tend to dominate the militaries in the Indo-Pacific region, and many of them are actually play a significant role in domestic affairs as well. And if you look at the so-called A2AD, the sort of defensive complexes that have been developed around the region, particularly in the north, they're optimised against missile defence, for missile defence, and against naval and air power. So land power provides an asymmetric opportunity, particularly for dispersed, small, protected and lethal land forces that can hide in the clutter of the environment. So I think there's a range of ways to look at the challenge. I think, as I said in my remarks, the conventional wisdom or the consciousness of the day is on the thing, the drone, the ballistic missile. But it's worth taking a step back there's that great quote from George Kennan about sort of looking at what's happening today at the expense of a more sort of broad view of history. And so with that in mind, understanding how asymmetry is applied, what can we learn from, let's just say, missile attacks by the Houthis that then engender a very expensive response, from the sorts of forces that we have today.
Okay, let me ask you about the people in the Army. You've said, for example, that those in the Army today wearing the uniform are the very best generation to wear our nation's uniform. And I've spoken to you privately how impressed with and proud you are of the younger men and women in the Australian Army. But the Army's not big enough, is it? And we seem to be having, across the services, a real problem with recruitment. Why is that? What else can we do to get the people into the ADF that we need?
Well, I begin by reinforcing my comments, and they're based on personal day-to-day experience with the young Australians that are serving in our Army today. They are the finest generation. They are incredibly intelligent, innovative, adaptive. They are responsive to the same values throughout the history of our Army and our ADF, and every bit up to the task. I'm optimistic because I think they're drawn from a society that has a whole lot more of them. And as you point out, we've got some more work to do. And when I say we, certainly the Army, certainly the ADF, the Department of Defence, but as a society, it's a shared problem. In an era of great power competition where defence and security is once again a national endeavour, this is a national challenge for us to work on together because the stakes are high. It's our quality of life and our way of life ultimately that are what's at stake. In terms of the mechanics of retention and recruiting, retention's actually a really good story. Fully 1.3% last year and the year before reduction in our separation rates. We're now actually below the rolling average separation rate in the Army for the last 30 years. So more people are staying in the Army and we know why. We'll continue to work on that and improve it. When it comes to recruiting, last year there was in the order of, I think just under 13% increase in expressions of interest to join. But there are challenges in the recruiting pipeline and we know where they are, so it's a matter of working on those. And they're practical things like medical examinations or security checks and those kinds of things. So that's the bit where our performance has to improve if we are to translate the expressions of interest into soldiers serving in our Army today. It is one of the key issues for us today.
All right, let me ask one more question, then I'm going to go to the audience. Australia has a volunteer military. We've got a vexed history with conscription, of course, but I would say, speaking personally, when you go to countries that have a tradition of compulsory military service, like Finland or Israel, for example, you do get a sense that it provides a glue for the society and for the country. Is there an argument for national service in Australia, whether or not it's a military thing, some kind of service so that every young person contributes for a year or two of their life? Is that something you'd like Australia to think about?
Look, I think it's a great question, given the circumstances that we live in. Ultimately, it's a question and a conversation, a discussion between our elected representatives and those in our society. My personal preferences are neither here nor there. Those are decisions our society needs to make. And to the point I was making in my remarks, we need to be having those discussions between state, citizen and soldier if it's going to have a military application. But as I've said, we're all in this together. It's a national endeavour. How can each element of national power and each element of civil society contribute in a cohesive way to the kind of Australia we want to be in the 21st century?
I see how you dealt with that question. You had your missile defence ready. So well done. All right, let me go to the audience for a number of questions. And first of all, I saw Peter Harcher's hand up. Always quick with the hand, which we like to see. Peter?
Up with the hand, I'd be a happy chappy. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Simon. About 6 hours ago, the US President demonstrated that he is prepared to break agreements, pacts, treaties with Australia, as well as in the terms of the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, plus the country's broader commitments under the World Trade Organization, which of course the US established. The ADF is dependent on the US for a great many capabilities, kit, software updates, munitions, spare parts, intelligence, nuclear umbrella. To your mind, what are the capabilities where Australia most urgently needs to establish an independence from US supply to improve what our Prime Minister and our opposition leader have said Australia needs to do, which is to develop a more independent stance?
Yep. So thanks for the softball question, Peter. Right. I begin going back to that George Kennan quote, which is about taking a step back from the circumstances of today and looking at the history, in this case to your question, the history of our alliance, which has many dimensions to it and has a long history going back to the Battle of Hamel on the Western Front in the First World War. It was the first time that Australian and American soldiers fought together. We have fought together, bled together and died together in every major war since. One of the reasons, and in my own experience and many soldiers that are in the room today, that we have such a close relationship with the United States today is because of the relationships we have, the personal relationships we have developed by fighting, bleeding and dying together over the last 20 years in places like Afghanistan. So there's the political level, there are institutions, there's the military to military, there's the civil society links, and I think it's worthy of us looking at the whole picture. Certainly the decisions, the pronouncements, the policy and the positions of our elected representatives are very important, but how they manifest over time, I think is worthy of us just taking a step back and looking at. You're exactly right. We have been working over many years to ensure that we are interoperable or integrated with the US in particular, but also our other allies. That is not a one-way street, and increasingly is of mutual benefit. And I'd have to really, I think, highlight our scientists and our industrialists for the work that they've done to ensure that it's very much a mutual benefit over the years. So I think interests will really matter when it comes down to it. And so what I'm looking at are how those interests play out, what are the institutional relationships, and we've got at that sort of next level down, we've got contractual relationships as well, where we pay for a service or we are there's an exchange in kind. We're also around the region and around the world working today together. So that's what we're, in a military sense, Army to Army sense, Army to Marines and Army to US Special Operations focused on today. I've seen no evidence that there's any change in any of the arrangements we have in place. To the other part of the question, which is about what are we and should we be doing to build national resilience, I think there's quite a bit going on together. I won't enter the debate about percentages of GDP or anything like that, but the key point is, and I think we learnt this during COVID, is that there's an amazing amount of capacity, innovation, and intellect in our company across civil society, whether that's in the manufacturing industry, whether that's in new technologies, whether that's in our military, that's able to work together. So the final point I'd make is that things like guided weapons, explosive ordnance, the onshore ability to build the machines of war can't be delivered overnight. They take time to do, and it's a bit like, when's the best time to plant a tree? Well, it was yesterday, but we've got to deal with the world as it is today, and there's a lot going on to build our domestic capacity. At the end of the day, that's always going to be a factor of what we're prepared nationally to invest in, and what the incentives to invest in are.
I'm going to take two questions so that we can try to squeeze as many in as possible. I'll see these two hands. First, the lady in the aisle, and then the gentleman a couple of rows back.
The Mandarin, thank you for your speech. When you talk about the Army being a national institution, a profession, and a fighting force, I'm interested to know which of those three domains you think we need to engage society with understanding better and more, and to what extent the Army's role responding during times of natural disaster play into those things and possibly detract from the fighting force element.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Before you answer, I'm going to take another question, and then you can, further back, Rachel. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Lieutenant General Ben Doherty from The Guardian, thanks for your time this afternoon. Following on the theme of Peter's question, we saw in recent weeks very senior members of the US administration using Signal to discuss airstrikes on Yemen, airstrikes that killed 50 people, including children, and the leaking of that classified information to journalists and into the public domain. Has that changed the way you talked about interoperability and the way the Australian military interacts with the US? Has that changed the way the Australian military will interact with the US, and has it changed the way you've sent and distributed classified information?
Thanks. Look, if I can start with the second question first, quite simply, zero change in terms of the military to military. We use the appropriately classified systems to do that. So no change is the simple answer to your question in terms of how, speaking for myself, the Australian Army communicates with our US teammates. It's on the systems, the departmental and the military systems that we have traditionally used to communicate on.
You don't use Signal and Gmail to communicate confidential information to all your colleagues?
No. To the first question, the way I describe our Army is in those three dimensions: national institution, profession, fighting force, but with a past, a present and a future. And that's sort of my mental framework to understand what I'm have stewardship of and am accountable for. And I think each of those dimensions work together to create sort of who we are, to anchor us in our past, to ensure that we are humble about our present, and ensure that we are investing in the inheritance of those who will lead, command and operate our Army, rather than being focused in today on building a legacy, if I can use that nuance. So I think they all require care and attention because it's in their interaction that lies our strength, but also reflects our accountabilities to those who serve, but also to the society that we serve, and indeed the government of the day. And at the centre of that, the central strategic priority that I've set for our Army during my period of stewardship is trust. Trust in our own teams, trust with the society and the community that we serve, trust with the government of the day, trust of our allies and partners. To your specific question about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and domestically, I would always expect that we would play a role in supporting our communities in their time of need, but that we are best employed both effectively and efficiently in support of the civil authorities who are experts in these things in the response phase. And the response phase is your days, weeks. When it comes to relief, recovery and resilience, that is, there are other experts, other organisations that are much better at it and much more efficient to it. To your point, absolutely, any effort brings with it an opportunity cost, but that's an opportunity cost that we can adequately absorb when we're involved in response. So that's, I think, a reasonable way. I think that's reflected in the building of capacity through the National Emergency Management Authority, some additional funding there, the integration at the state, local and the state and federal levels to ensure that when the ADF is required, that it's able to actually add value.
Simon, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you one final personal question, actually, and that is you joined the Army as a private soldier. You've risen to the top of the ranks, which says something positive, I think, about the democratic character of the Australian Army. Now, when you sit at the top, is there one, and I know you're a student of history yourself, is there one military commander that you really admire, whether that's an Australian from the Australian or perhaps from the Civil War or wherever? When you read the history, is there one leader that you really respect and admire?
Look, there are so many.
You've got to give me one.
One. I think I'd probably have to go to George Marshall, and in particular, not what he did during the war was remarkable, but if you look at what he was tasked with before the war, it was about building the civil capacity. It was by every measure an unremarkable and an uncelebrated job. But he truly exemplified service, selfless service, and built across the United States of America a capacity among civil society, which I think was a key contributor to national resilience during the war. So a quiet and humble achiever.
Yeah. And part of that generation of statesmen, including Dean Acheson, that created this world order. Indeed. So, look, it's been an honour to have you, so thank you very much, General. We haven't even talked about your most important role, which is a patron of the Army Drone Racing Team. So if you want to hang around afterwards, you can ask the General about that. But in the meantime, we really enjoy having senior officers come and talk to us, and we respect the service that you and your brothers and sisters provide to Australia, so thank you for that. But most importantly today, thank you for giving a very considered speech and for taking our questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.